All right, everybody, welcome back into the Go 247 podcast. I am Glenn West, the senior writer here at the site. Joined today by Sonny Ship, our recruiting guru, our fearless leader. Sonny, thanks for hopping on today. We've got a lot to talk about with LSU via the transfer portal and upcoming visits and targets and positions to watch and monitor. We'll get into all that stuff, but before we kind of break it all down, just wanted to remind you guys to please like and subscribe on the pod. It really helps us out as we try to grow this thing out, and anything you can do in terms of just liking and subscribing, where on YouTube or Spotify or Apple, really helps us out. So thank you so much for that. But with that, Sonny, pretty busy week for LSU in terms of portals entrance. I think we can probably just start with that. LSU currently has 9 players in the portal as we're recording this, but only I think about 5 or 6 of those were on the active roster. You talk about Raydarius Jones, Antoine Sampa, Philip Webb. Those are guys who were not a part of the 2022 roster, but whose names were officially entered into the portal. Along with this group of players from the roster, guys that varying degrees of playing time, obviously can see opportunities elsewhere. Just, I guess, break it down a little bit in terms of what we've seen so far and how LSU is kind of handling some of the players that have left in the portal so far.
Well, I think early on, if you look at the first week, can't look at the first week, but if you look at the first 4 days, because I'm sure it's going to change on Friday. But your first 4 days, if you're LSU head coach Brian Kelly, you hated losing Jack Besh. But when you got Kayshon Boutte back from from leaving to go to the NFL draft or the transfer portal, huge win. Especially if the Kayshon that you're going to see next year is the Kayshon that you've seen really since about the Alabama game. I think a little bit, the Alabama game and especially Texas A&M and then really at Georgia, you started to see that suddenness and that explosiveness from Kayshon Boutte that we saw this first 2 years in Baton Rouge. So it was obvious that he finally worked off the rust. He finally got to where he needed to be mentally. So, that was a huge pickup right there. Losing Jack Besh hurts, but if you're going to lose someone at a position, wide receiver is the place for it to be, considering they still have 10 guys in that room when you count, or I'm sorry, 11 guys in that room when you count 10 guys in the room when you count the 6 coming back.
Yeah.
When you count the 6 coming back, counting Kayshon, and then the 4 coming in. So
Yep.
you've still got a deep room right there. And the rest of the early portal entries that we've seen are really decisions that the kids made that's going to benefit them, but it's also going to benefit LSU too. You had Demarius McGee, who played 1 game this year, Cam Wire, who started off the year with getting play time and then got to the point to where he got very little. He still got a year of eligibility. He'll get a fresh start somewhere else. And then I think the biggest surprise probably outside of Jack Best was probably Desmond Little.
Mm-hmm.
That was one that when you looked at the Jack linebacker position, it's hard for me to plug Harold Perkins into that spot as an every down player.
Right.
It's just I just can't see a 220, maybe 225 pounder playing that on an every down position in the SEC. And so Desmond Little really had a chance, barring a big time difference maker coming in and being in for spring ball. Desmond Little had a very good chance of being that number 1 Jack linebacker going in, entering spring practice, assuming that BJ Ojulari does declare for the draft. So that one was a little bit surprising. But Raydarius Jones, he wasn't on the roster. It was good to see him get academically eligible to where he could enter the portal. And, so just going down those lists of the early entries that you've seen, there haven't been any that I think really really hurts LSU. And Jack Besh is a fine player, a fan favorite, and everything, and he's going to put up good numbers wherever he goes. But he if you look at how the regular season ended, he was probably going to be your number 5 receiver going into the into the spring, assuming that there's no more attrition from guys like Brian Thomas, Malik Neighbors, Kyron Lacey, those guys.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that you mentioned there that are really interesting. I think with in regards to Little's case, I tend to agree. I think there's some young players that LSU really loves in terms of that position. I think Savion Jones is a guy you could probably plug into that spot next year and really see what he can do as a jack linebacker. I think he kind of fits that mold a little bit better. They're really high on Quincy Wiggins, the true freshman. They think they've seen a lot from him as this kind of 2022 season has progressed, and he's a guy that could get a lot of snaps along the defensive line. And I just kind of go back to what we've heard from Coach Kelly this year, or in recent weeks. Really, is they 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 want to build this thing, from freshmen up, and you can't keep doing that if you keep having guys from the portal and guys that are only got 1 or 2 years of eligibility that come in and they take reps away from younger players that you're trying to develop. And I'm not saying, I mean, Desmond Little's been on this roster for 3 or 4 years now, so I'm not saying that is in regards to his case in particular, but just I think there is a little heightened sense of just trying to get these younger guys, more snaps and more development. And so I think what you're seeing is just some natural attrition with the older veterans that maybe weren't going to see those opportunities come spring this year. I think another great example is Cole Taylor, the tight end who's in the portal now. Um, he was actually really important for LSU. They like to run a lot of those 12 personnel lineups and use him as a blocker. But I think LSU is in a position right now where they can go out and try to find some quality depth, whether it's in the freshman class, whether it's in the portal. You've got Mac Markway coming in here. Can he be a guy that LSU really relies on early in his career, like Mason Taylor this year? There's a lot of guys that I think there are no real big surprises to me. I think even the best news was a little bit more expected just because it is a numbers game at some point. I think probably one of the big remaining questions is what happens with the quarterback battle or with the quarterback position, just in terms of what attrition is going to go on there. Jaden Daniels has a huge decision to make on whether or not he's going to go pro. And I think all that kind of trickles down into what Nussmeier and even Walker Howard ultimately decide. I think we're kind of in agreement. You and I have talked a lot this week about that position group, and I think there's kind of a general sense or a belief that maybe if LSU has all three of those guys back in the spring, that you'll see a waiting period in terms of which guy could potentially enter the portal or decide to move on after the spring. So I think there's a lot to look forward to there. Just what are your thoughts though on just the quarterback situation and kind of how all that plays out?
I think Jaden Daniels probably, when you consider those big games that he had against Florida, led him against Ole Miss, played very well against, played well against Alabama. I think going into, probably after the UAB game, that he was probably, that he went from probably coming back to it being maybe a little bit more of a question now, because all of a sudden now, you saw what happened against Garrett Nussmeier in the SEC championship game. And this is not about anyone being afraid of competition.
Yeah,
I hate when that comes up on the message board and stuff, because it's all about kids just wanting to play,
yeah,
wanting to play.
absolutely.
And, some don't have the patience that others do. Um, but I think I think in that situation that I still lean more towards your quarterback room is going to have those three guys in it, and they'll go through the spring. And
Yeah,
then once the spring, and I don't, that's not something that I'm ready to say, okay, you book it, this is going to happen or anything like that. But that's where I lean to right now.
yeah.
I think it's interesting that Mel Kiper's big board came out. He had Jaden Daniels as a day 2 pick, right?
Yeah, like number 5 quarterback in the
Yeah,
draft.
number 5 quarterback in the draft. I did not expect that, and you hadn't really seen a lot of draft boards, a lot of talk coming out about where guys ranked and stuff. So that was a little bit surprising right there,
Yeah.
because when you consider the quarterback class, I don't think it's a super heavy quarterback class to begin with, and so for to see him that high, I think that probably also is a reason that I think he probably went from a guy who was probably coming back to like, okay, well, maybe now I've got something to think about a little bit more, because a lot of these, the NFL, the feedback from the NFL and stuff, they get the coaches get that kind of feedback throughout the season and stuff, but it really starts coming in earnest, and they really start getting those draft projections. What kids should do from the advisory committee and things like that. Once the season ends. So I think that he's probably got a little bit more of a decision to make, maybe than he had, a few weeks back, and then I think that you'll kind of see the trickle down effect.
Yeah.
Once he makes a decision, then I think you'll see Garrett Nussmeier, kind of make his decision, and then Walker Howard will kind of make his decision from that point on too. But that's going to be I think that's going to be one of those questions that you're probably not going to get an answer on, until you get deeper into this 45-day window. And just for those who are, for those who aren't, it's hard to be caught up on all the transfer portal rules. We've got this transfer portal window that opened Monday that goes until January 19th. And then once spring practice, if spring practice isn't over for these schools, it will be over very shortly after that. But April 15th starts the second window. So players can enter the portal again after spring practice. And as long as they're in the portal between that 15-day window, then they have a little bit more flexibility as far as choosing their school goes. So it's not like they have to make a decision before school starts in January.
Yeah, no, I think that's all really great stuff. I mean, my personal take on Jaden is, I think he's a classic example of a guy that if he decides to test the NFL waters and go through the combine and testing and everything, he's a guy that could see his stock rise dramatically. Because I mean, when NFL teams look at that athleticism, that speed, combined with I think an improved arm, I think there's no question that he improved his arm talent this year while at LSU. It's going to be something for him to consider, and I think there's definitely more of a question mark around him now, and it's going to be interesting because you know I think the deadline for players to get into the draft or announce that they're going into the draft is January 2nd or somewhere next month in that range. And so if he kind of drags this out a little bit, what kind of impact does that have on a guy like Nussmeier who's also trying to make a decision? So there's going to be a lot of balls in the air, I think, until that decision comes from Jaden. And we don't have a firm timeline on when that could happen. So it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to follow that room in particular. I think there's just a lot of other positions though that LSU is going to have to focus on in the meantime. We've talked about the offensive line. I think really the three that come to mind for me is the secondary. You're going to have to rebuild the secondary. You've got a lot of seniors, a lot of guys who lost their or just kind of graduated and don't have any eligibility remaining, who are moving on. Mekhi Garner's a guy who just announced on December the 8th that he's going to be heading out to the NFL. So that's a guy you're going to have to replace in the cornerback room. A lot of older safeties in that room, a lot of older cornerbacks who could be moving on. So that's priority number one, at least in my eyes. I would say building the quality depth in the offensive line and on the defensive line, in the trenches is going to be probably number two for me in terms of just the biggest needs. And I think those are the two biggest areas where LSU really needs to improve their depth, particularly along the offensive line. I mean, we've started to see some of it, break out here in this first week in terms of guys who are moving on. But I think you're going to continue to see some more movement on the O line. And LSU's got to bring in some guys that they think are going to be big fits for the program. They've obviously got a really good recruiting class coming in if they can keep those guys that are currently committed, and Zalance Hurd and Tyree Adams and DJ Chester and Paul Mubenga. Those are guys that I think you can really build a core foundation around as your depth next year. But do they flirt with portal guys, and do they flirt with getting more freshmen in here? I think there's going to be really a lot of movement on that O line. But just in terms of the secondary and the defense and offensive line, just kind of where would you rank maybe those positions in terms of need, in terms of where LSU needs to see the most improvement?
Well, with Mekhi Garner declaring for the draft, there was some hope that he may come back. With him declaring for the draft, got to find a veteran corner, a plug and play guy, just like a Jarrett Bernard Converse was last year. You knew coming in that he was going to grab a starting spot. You gotta have one of those guys, because you can't. LSU is going to have an impressive freshman class that's going to be coming in. I think they're going to finish with Javian Toviano. I think they're going to finish with Desmond Ricks. You look at the guys that are already in the fold. You have Jeremiah Hughes. You have Ashton Stamps. Dalen Austin. What's he going to do? I still lean more towards he's going to end up somewhere else, especially since he's signing in February. So they're going to have some talented freshmen that they can put out there, but you can't ask Robert Steeples to have to put, all freshmen out there. Right. And, with Jay Ward opting to declare for the draft instead of, taking advantage of his COVID year to come back, that could have potentially been another corner that you could have put in there. So I think you absolutely have to find – one plug and play guy, and then you got to find another corner that can give you some experience, that you don't necessarily have to view as a plug and play guy, but a guy who can come in and who can compete for that job, who can compete with some of these freshmen to see, if any of those guys are ready. Then right after that, I put Jack linebacker. You said something interesting, Savion Jones. I do think he's a guy that could potentially play that Jack linebacker position. But if you put Jones over on that side, then who do you put at the other end? You surely don't want to have to put Quincy Wiggins out there. And,
I don't know.
When you look at the depth, and the reason that I say that is because, one, he was raw. Two, he was hurt this year and stuff. And so you just don't want to have to, you would like to be able to bring him along a little more slowly and not have to, count on him knowing where he's got to be, when he's got to be there, and everything for when you go to Orlando to play Florida State.
Yeah.
And so, and so that's why I put an experienced pass rusher, like Braden Swinson, the Oregon guy who they offered, someone like that as just as big of a priority as that plug and play cornerback. Yeah. Because, Desmond Little, I looked at Desmond Little as a guy, okay, he's got 2 years left. He might be able to, he can kind of help you fill the gap a little bit. But he was always a guy that I looked at more of in the role that he was in this year before Harold Perkins emerged. He was that guy that would get the reps after B.J. Ojulari. When Ojulari didn't play against, was it New Mexico?
He missed a couple. I think he missed a couple of the Southern. I don't think he played against Southern.
Yeah, and Little came in, and Little started the game, and I think he actually had a sack, if I'm not mistaken, in that game. Yeah, and actually, and he actually showed some stuff that gave you some optimism, gave you a little bit of hope for him being able to, to play that, to be a solid backup that you could count on. And so I really put a big emphasis on that position. And then you need another defensive tackle. Hopefully there's no attrition. Jaquelin Roy, I think you're in agreement with me that you think he's headed to the NFL draft. Yeah. And so that leaves Mason Smith, Mekhi Wingo, Jacobian Guillory. Quincy Wiggins at 275. I could see him easily getting up to 285, 290, and he's done that. He's done that before. So I think he's a guy who he's kind of like he reminds me kind of like a Chad Jones in a way, a guy who's going to have to fight his body from getting too big for the position that he plays. And
Chad Jones was a little bit raw too, wasn't he, coming out of high school, if I remember?
Well, Well, he played a lot of safety. He just had that two sport label.
Yeah,
He was kind of considered just as good of a baseball prospect as he was
right.
in football. But he had played a lot of football at Southern Lab. Um, so those positions are, I think, really some main positions that you have to look at. Tight end. Is not as big of an emphasis for me as it once was, even though you lost Cole Taylor. And that's because you have Mason Taylor, who has proved that he's a bona fide starter in the
Yeah,
SEC. You have Mac Markway coming in to where, granted, he hasn't played much football since his freshman year. Only a little bit his sophomore year, especially in 2020. So there's a little bit of uncertainty on what you're going to get from him. But when you look at his body, when you look at what he's done in the past, he's that inline blocker that you wanted Cole Taylor to be a little bit better at. You wanted him to be a little more physical than he was, um, and so how quickly is he able to make that adjustment? So I think tight end, depending on if you're able to finish with Kamori and Pimpton, the Vanderbilt commitment, if you're able to go ahead and get Jackson McGohan, the former Cincinnati commitment, on board this weekend, to go with Markway, then I think you have a little bit more flexibility as far as the tight end position goes. But I still think you need to get a guy who's got a little bit of experience, who doesn't intend coming on and competing for the starting job, but who will be fine with being in that backup role. So for me, I guess those are probably the ones that I look
yeah,
at the most. When quarterback, I don't think is a big need right now. Obviously, with the room that LSU has, I don't think linebacker is a big need. Assuming that you've got Harold Perkins and Mario Tolan,
Greg
uh,
Penn,
Craig Penn.
Wes
You've got
Weeks.
West Weeks coming back. So you've got some guys in that room. So it's going to be hard to convince a
Yeah,
guy to come in and, a guy who's a starter, an SEC starter. It's going to be hard to convince a guy like that to come in, I think. Um, and then, the offensive line, you had mentioned the offensive line, and yeah, that probably does go hand in hand with the defensive line, especially if LSU has some attrition that we're both expecting, just from older guys who still have 2 years of eligibility left to play, who have already been passed up by younger guys. And then you've got a heralded offensive line class coming in from the high school crop with the 2023 class. I think you're going to see several guys
yeah. So
look to move on.
yeah, so I think for the offensive line, I would imagine that LSU builds their depth back up through the freshman talent, through that freshman class that's coming in. Those four guys, maybe they add one more, maybe they take in a guy from the portal. But I think one of the interesting kind of questions is what happens at that guard spot with Anthony Bradford and Garrett Dellinger. We kind of talked about that a little bit this week as well between you and me. That's something that's going to have to play out. But look, LSU has a strong starting lineup, their strong foundation with those core four, Charles Turner, Miles Frazier, and the two freshmen, Will Campbell and Emory Jones. I think that's a really strong outlook for next year. Another year of development of those guys under Brad Davis's leadership. I think you're looking at a pretty sizable improvement, I think, from the O line, and they showed a lot of great signs as the season moved on this year. They had a lot of really great performances. In terms of the secondary, there is just one name that I also want to float out is Sevyn Banks. We don't know what happens with him. He hasn't officially announced anything yet, but I think there's an expectation after another injury riddled season is that he could be back and kind of a veteran voice for this group that is looking to probably be pretty young in terms of the guys that they're bringing in. So is he a guy that compete for one of those outside corner spots? I think that's a really interesting question.
And you
Um,
really have to. He really has to.
yeah,
you
yeah,
know, he really needs to just look at, there's you can't look at. I don't think you can look at Sevyn Banks as a guy that you hope steps up. You need him to step
you
up
need
now.
him to. Yeah,
Now if you go out and you go out and you get a couple of, you go out and you get your guy from Virginia. Of course, there's the Denver Harris talk, out of Texas A&M. You've got Gavin Holmes out of Wake Forest, a guy that I know they like too. So you've got some guys in there But yeah, if you can't get two veterans and you can only get one, then you really need Seven
7 to
Banks
step
to,
up.
you need
Yeah.
him to bring it this spring.
Because we know Ricks and we know Toviano are guys that are just really, really talented, really, but they're just really young. I mean, Ricks is a reclassified senior to this group. I mean, he technically
Yeah,
should be going into his senior year next year in high
he's
school.
really a baby.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and he's got all the talent in the world. He could come in and really push for a spot, but it'll just be really interesting
Yeah.
to see how that
And
that
keep an eye on Terrence Welch too.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that's a good
I
one.
think
Yeah.
LaTerrence Welch is a guy. He made a little bit of noise and stuff,
Hmm.
and you didn't see him a lot on defense and stuff. But he played in just about every game this year on special teams. So I think he's a guy that you look at and that you feel pretty good about. And he may actually, when you consider the questions with Banks' injuries and stuff, when you look at LSU's quarterback room right now, and you say, okay, if this is your room right here, who's
Hmm.
it going to be? I think LaTerrence Welch is a guy you look at and you say, okay,
Yeah.
this is your number one corner right here.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I do want to get into some talk of just some portal targets. We've talked a lot about some of the attrition that could happen at these various positions. You mentioned Braden Swinson. I think that's a name to keep an eye on. The Oregon transfer. He's got really great ties with Jamar Kane, dating back to his recruiting days. Some other really interesting names, and this just kind of falls into the guys that kind of fit the mold of what Coach Kelly has talked about and what they want. They're looking for guys with recruiting with past ties to Louisiana, guys who maybe grew up in this state, and they're looking for fit first and foremost. And I don't think there's, at least on paper, a better fit for LSU than a guy like a Jalen Lee from Florida, who's a defensive tackle prospect who has entered the portal, and a guy who's from Louisiana, a guy who I think could step in and give you some really quality depth on the interior. We've talked about him. JQ Hardaway is another name that we have kind of just listed. Cypress, the cornerback from Virginia that you mentioned just a moment ago. Dominic Lovett, the receiver from Missouri, is a name that we've heard floated around as a potential portal entrant that LSU could be interested in. Just looking at some of the names here, Sonny, just is there any one or few guys in particular that you think would be just really great fits here and could really help uh, you know with some of the rebuild that they have to do with some of these key positions?
Yeah, well, the kid out of Virginia, I butcher his name all the time. You
Fan,
want to say
Ventrell Cypress. I'll just
exactly,
call him Cypress. Let's just call him
exactly.
Cypress. That's an
This kid doesn't have ties to
yeah,
LSU or to Louisiana, I should say. But what people have to remember is that Jordan Arsamon, one of LSU's two recruiting specialists, who plays pivotal roles
yeah,
in the LSU staff in their recruiting efforts, along with Sherman Wilson. He used to be at Virginia. So while you don't have that Louisiana connection, you have that other connection that Brian Kelly puts a lot of stock in, and that's someone having a personal connection to that person to where they can kind of get all of the info and know exactly what they're getting and who they're bringing into their locker room. So when you don't hear that they're from Louisiana, we saw a few instances. Jaden Daniels is a perfect
California.
example.
Yeah,
Weeks is a perfect example.
yeah,
Another example of the Virginia connection that
yeah,
didn't have Louisiana ties, but he was from Virginia. So he's an interesting one. Gavin Holmes out of Wake Forest transfer, played his high school ball at Rummel. He has that obvious connection that that they really like and that they put emphasis on. Those two guys to me, when I look at the fit and of kind of knowing what you're going to get, I think those two guys are probably at the top of my list. You look at Denver Harris, and there's a little bit of baggage that comes with him. But the thing that LSU fans should feel good about there is that with Mike Farrar, he's in LSU's player personnel department. He used to be at Texas A&M.
Yeah.
So he has, he has some ways, and he knows some folks that he can kind of get the backstory and get some information on that can help them, dot those I's and cross those T's when it comes to Harris. But I think that when you put the emphasis that you have on cornerback, I think that's an area, right there where those guys jump out at you. Something else to keep in mind is that we had that initial wave for the
Right.
transfer portal Monday, Tuesday. Names are kind of trickling out a little bit slower now. Next week, once final exams are over, not only at LSU but other schools around the country, and so you're going to see a new wave.
Hmm.
Because you've got kids who are, one, they have to make sure that they're academically eligible, and they
Yeah.
need those grades to come in to be able to do that before they can enter the portal. But then two, you've got guys who just don't want to deal with the madness, because once they put their name in the portal, I mean, it's like recruiting. It's like recruiting on steroids
Yeah. Yeah.
with the short time frame that the coaches have to work with. And so it's smart for some of these kids to say, okay, I'm going to get my finals out of the way first, and then I'll deal with this stuff. So I
Right.
think you've got another wave coming, coming next week, to where you'll have more names out there. There's some chatter, there's some innuendo on message boards and stuff of some potential Louisiana guys who could enter the portal. But I think that that when that is probably a good starting point. When guys enter the portal, you see that they're from Louisiana. Okay, you put an asterisk by that, and you say, okay, I need to do some research right here. Need to check on this guy right here, because that is something that that Kelly has talked about a lot, and that they really put that emphasis on. And I think it goes back to what they're bringing into the locker room. They
Yeah.
feel good about bringing a Louisiana guy into their locker
Sure.
room, because he's going to know other kids, and he's not going to know other kids from being recruited, from playing against them, from being in the same city as them and stuff. So when you see a guy hit the portal from Louisiana, I think that's that you say, okay, let's check this dude out.
Yeah, that to me is the most important aspect of all of this, because I think they really built a strong foundation this year of mindset and just what the daily expectations are for that program. And so you don't want to bring in a guy or guys that could potentially mess with that. And I think, when you're looking at uh just blueprint guys, blue collar guys that are going to come in and work, who have, pretty decent grades. I think that's another area where Kelly has really put an earmark, is, just what do their grades look like? Are they guys that we're going to bring in who, might struggle with the academic side, or are they going to be disciplined enough to work hard and on all aspects of their college life? And I think that's a really, really important matter that Kelly feels strongly about. And so, they're going to recruit to that. I think they're going to
And the
recruit.
proof is in the pudding for
Right.
that too. You go back and you look at this last transfer class. You made it a focus to where, okay, let's focus on the guys that we can. Makai Wingo, no Louisiana ties, but you have Robert Steeples from Missouri.
Yeah.
And so
And he comes in and is one of your best leaders. I mean,
one of your best leaders,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Joe Fouché, Greg Brooks, Bernard Converse,
Garner.
Makai Garner. You can just go down the list. And so it's like, the method. Excuse me, the method that they used, it's been put to the test,
Yeah,
and to me it passed that test.
I do too. I think so.
Does it again? You don't know that, but you say, okay, we fared pretty well in putting that as our focus and our priority, and it worked well in the locker room, so let's stick with that.
Yeah, no, I agree completely, and I think it's just going to be a big part of what they recruit to moving forward. Before we get out of here, I do. This is going to be a big weekend for visitors in terms of high school kids. LSU is not only recruiting for the portal right now, but they're recruiting for, more importantly, a strong finish in this freshman class in 2023. Just I know you've been working the phone lines tirelessly the last couple of days, trying to see what LSU is going to be bringing in. Just I guess talk about a little bit of the visitor list that's expected for this really important weekend as we narrow down the stretch of the early signing period.
Yeah, and I think you look at I say uncommitted guys, two guys who are not committed to LSU, and that's Vanderbilt tight end commitment, Kamorian Pimpton, and then one-time Cincinnati commit, tight end commit Jackson McGohan out of Ohio, who Mike Denbrock has a a solid relationship with, goes back over time. And so, I think you start with those two guys right there, because you have to feel pretty good about the other guys who are coming in, the other commits. You've got Dylan Carpenter out of Santa Mont, Tyree Adams out of St. Aug. He's coming in, and I'm trying to remember the names. So got to
Well,
help me here,
yeah. Well,
unless I have to grab my phone.
yeah, they got a bunch of guys that I'll just take it from just the perspective of what they're doing outside of the state right now. These coaches are all in on these recruits right now. I mean, you just saw pictures with Desmond Ricks and Brian Kelly and Robert Steeples. Kelly's been all over the state of Louisiana with the commits that they've got in for this recruiting class. They're doing a really nice job of getting out and making themselves visible during this week and next week, because it's going to be, really just all for better lack of terms, just all hell breaks loose, in the last couple weeks here as the signing period really gets closer. But just are there a couple other guys that you've
Yeah,
seen?
Caleb Jackson's coming in, the running back commit. I say coming in, he's in Baton Rouge.
He's at Liberty Magnet, like 2 miles away.
Ashton Stamps, the cornerback out of New Orleans. He'll be coming up for his official visit. Zalance Hurd, the big offensive tackle out of Neville, he'll be coming in for his official visit. And so they'll have anywhere from we've got 7 on the list right now. And I think the big one to keep an eye on is Kamorian Pimpton, the Vanderbilt commitment. Is does he make it in? Does he make it in? Texas is showing some interest. Some in-state schools are kind of showing a little bit more interest in him and stuff. And so that's one that it's really kind of tough to gauge right now, because you wouldn't think that he would be the Vanderbilt that Vanderbilt would be, I guess, as high as it has remained on his list once these bigger offers started coming in, like your LSU, like the schools from the inside, from the in-state schools. But that hasn't become obvious or anything, and it really, I think it really has people questioning, like kind of wondering, like, okay, what's really going on here? And so that's one that I'm kind of looking at, saying, okay, does he make it to campus? And then that's the first step. Once you get into campus, it's like, okay, then you kind of start to say, okay, well, then that LSU has, that LSU's in it, because a kid like him is not going to take an official visit this late in the process just to take a trip.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree completely. And look, I think another one that's going to be on the minds of everybody is Desmond Ricks. It sounds like he's on pace to come in next weekend, not this coming
He's going to
weekend.
Bama this weekend.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
he's going to Bama this weekend.
just a guy that LSU needs. I think if you're marking the positions of needs, cornerback is number one on at least on my list. I think it's on your list too. But and there's no more talented player, I think, right now in the high school class that's uncommitted than Desmond Ricks. I think he's just a really fine football player and a guy that LSU would love to have. So we'll be monitoring all of this over the next several weeks. We'll probably get Sonny back on for another pod before early signing period and all that stuff. And it's going to be, dig in, guys. It's going to be a busy next couple weeks, but ones that we're really excited for. So with that, we'll certainly catch you guys later.